Well, good morning, everyone. I'd like to call the August 9th meeting of the Finance and Planning Committee to order. One little bit of business to do, a little disclaimer statement related to videos. Official recordings, videos, or transcriptions of HSV Property Owners Association committee meetings and/or board meetings will be done by authorized personnel only and can be viewed on the HSV Property Owner Association YouTube channel and explorethevillage.com. Any other recording, video, or transcription of HSV Property Owner Association committee meetings and/or board meetings is not considered the official record of the HSV Property Owners Association committee meetings and/or board meetings. With that out of the way, next item on the agenda, review and approval of the minutes from the previous meeting. Kathy, thank you for getting those out.
Well, getting better.
You were doing better than
Thank you, Tom, for the edits.
You were doing better than I did this time around, as you could tell. Jenna didn't come out until this morning or last night, so I didn't have any other commentary on the minutes. Does anybody else have anything?
No.
If not, motion to approve.
Motion.
Second.
Second.
All in favor? Aye. Motion carries. So for today's agenda, I put a couple things out there on the agenda. May want to adjust a little bit. Goodbye. Unknown caller. I don't want to know you. First item was a brief discussion on the 22 budget guidance. There was a draft put together, and I know that that was also in process inside of the POA, so I figured we'd talk about that quickly. Discussion of some of the red line policy documents. We talked about, we reviewed a couple of the reserve fund and emergency fund policies, potential red line discussion for that. We also got some feedback from our village banker on recommendations for a investment strategy. And then the other thing I had on the agenda is just a little bit of possible future things to come based on some of the conversations I've had or been involved in the last couple of weeks of things that might end up coming. Goodbye. Thank you. Might end up coming to the to this committee, depending on how things break. Did I miss anything? Is there anything else we need to put on the agenda? So, if not, let's start with the budget guidance. And Tom, I think you were responsible for putting this thing together, so thank you very much. Having not gone back and looked at the legacy budget guidance, I can't say as I had anything in particular in the way of recommendations or feedback on this one. I didn't know if anybody else did. My thought really was to take this information and pass it along to Karina and let her take this and whatever other budget guidance was in the mill and go ahead and publish that budget guidance. I'm sure you're having to do that for your folks as you go through the budget cycle anyway. And I think from our standpoint, we just would like to get a copy of whatever that guidance looks like so that we know what to expect when the budget starts coming our way. So.
And I would like to add, just for the most part, we're pretty much in line between the staff's outline and here.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll go through and make sure everything kind of compares, and we'll get that back to you.
Okay, cool. That works for me.
So you guys are all good with this now, though? I can use it for the comparison. No more comments to be added to it.
I think.
I saw no comments.
Yeah. I think it's classified as good enough.
Can I add something else regarding budget?
Sure.
It's really an issue of calendaring. Once it hits big, hard, and heavy. Right now, we are scheduled for our normal second and fourth Monday of the month. Karina in particular, would it be necessary to expect a substantially different,
Yes.
okay.
I'm sure it would be.
So right now, just so you guys are all aware, this week we are meeting with staff and the GM to go over all of the fee schedules. Once we have all of that reviewed and complete, I want to be able to present it to you guys. So I'd probably bring the staff in and we'll knock it all out at once. So I would say next week, if you guys wanted to go ahead and move a meeting up, or it'd be 2 weeks out if we kept our regular schedule. Then beginning in the middle of September is when we're gonna start presenting the actual budget itself.
Okay.
So I don't think we need a huge increase until then, but we may want a couple extra to go over the fees and stuff.
Okay.
Well,
So
I mean-
that's a good point. I think next week, I know I'm out of pocket next week. I've got some personal commitments. I know Jeff's out of pocket, rather far out of pocket next week.
Next month.
So next week might not be a good idea to try to put a meeting on the calendar, so maybe keep our regular meeting in 2 weeks. And then, once we get a better idea of what the fee schedule looks like, and then kind of the detailed plan for rolling out the remainder of the budget, we may have to add a couple meetings to our
Yeah.
calendar.
Well, I mean, in my world, it's usually easier, if it works for the committee, to schedule like every Monday and then cancel it, as opposed to waiting to the last minute and try to see what we can jam in. And I mean, that may or may not work, but,
Well, maybe, that's a good point from a logistics standpoint, especially for rooms and
Right.
things like that. We probably need to make sure we get on the calendar.
Well, that's where coming September, we may need to do it that way. I don't see a huge need for it before then, before
Right.
next month.
Yeah.
right, but like I said, once it starts coming in,
Yes.
it comes in droves.
So just on that point though, when you say September, are you talking about beginning of September, middle of September?
So we've got it on here to review the proposed budget with you guys from September 1st through the 14th. We've kind of got a 2-week window in there. So it'd probably be from the 1st and then
Realistically, that's like, oh,
a couple weeks.
yeah. I mean, one Monday.
Yeah,
And that's Labor Day,
yeah,
And
the
the
6th is
13th.
Labor Day.
or the 13th, which is
Yeah.
really only one day. So I'm just throwing out that if that's the window, we need to probably think about, I don't know, people might have plans already for Labor Day. I don't know if they don't, it doesn't matter, but we have to think about when people are available and stuff.
Yeah. Either that, or we may have to break the Monday,
Yeah.
we may have to put a couple of extra meetings on the calendar in that first couple weeks of
I kind of
September
suspect
window.
we will need
Okay.
to.
Maybe as a little bit of a reminder, we have seen something that looks like the budget in the O&M tables. They were, the second part of it. So we have a kind of an idea of what the budget looks like at the detail level, not the summary level. But we are, I believe, also asked to review fees, which is another 20 pages. That's, that's an overstatement. And maybe we don't need to, well, last time we were asked to review fees.
That's what I was
So-
saying, we're doing first.
Okay, all
So
right.
we're meeting with staff this week, and then once we're
That'll be
good there, I want to bring it all to you guys.
Yeah.
And we will be going over that before we go over the rest of the budget.
Okay, on that topic, I did submit a laundry list of irritating questions regarding fees. Have you seen this?
I did, let me see which one I've
I
got
mean,
here.
right now, that's just from me to you. It's not from the committee. And I don't know if the committee has any questions on fees. And this just, it's better to ask the question early on than it is at the last minute.
Yeah.
That's all.
Yeah.
Well, I actually thought some of these, we could discuss a little bit now, so they can include it when she meets with the committees.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, that's really, however, Karina and this committee wants to handle this, but, I mean, a lot of these questions are just sort of,
Is
kind
it
of residuals from last year. We kind of kicked it off a little bit, and then, the issues haven't gone away. So anyway,
Is it this one that starts Karina and all? Or
I don't know, it was an attachment as a essentially a, you know, a document. I mean, I could just give this to you.
I can re-forward it to you to save you on the budget document.
Sure.
Well,
It's
probably,
just what I call my laundry list of irritating questions.
Well, you had a few lists, so I was asking which one.
Yeah. I've gone into it.
you could,
I mean, do you want this?
That was a heading for the
yeah,
folder, Karina.
you kind of set yourself up for that one, Tom.
He's forwarding it to
I'm a
me.
glutton for punishment. Okay.
Well, so I guess,
Thanks.
and I
Okay.
have to admit, I did not read that for extreme detail, but the one thing that strikes me in the fee structure would be that it would be good to understand as the fee structure is being reviewed, just how many folks are actually availing themselves of a particular option in the fee structure. You know, because there are some pretty elaborate fee structures for some things. And the real question in my mind would be, if that's a fee structure that's being used by a reasonable number of the people who partake of that activity, great. If it's a fee structure that's being used by 2 people in a community of 15,000,
Can you give me an example, of what you're referring to? Maybe kind of like the facility room rentals, or?
I was thinking more the amenity fees and things like that for like, you know, the golf fees are one of the more elaborate sets of fee structures that we have. You know, if you've got 40 or 50, I don't know what the threshold number is for that. But if you've got 40 or 50 people that are implementing, that are using some piece of the fee structure, then okay, that makes sense. But if you've only got 2 or 3 people that are using that particular option in the fee structure, it kind of calls into question whether it's worth the overhead of establishing and maintaining that structure and everybody having to keep track of it to accommodate a very small number of people.
And we do review that. For an example would be, we used to have I want to say it was the quarterly golf pack, you know.
Semi-annual, I think it
and
was,
we'd
yeah.
sold 2 as in 2019, and we eliminated that
Yeah.
one. So they do look at all of that as they're
Yeah.
building it.
Yeah, I think that was the one in my mind that was the thing that was still kind of tickling at the back of my brain, just trying to make sure we were looking for that sort of thing.
Well, and part of that is, and it may not apply in all areas, but just in generality, if there's not a fee set, we can't charge anything. Golf is not an area where this scenario would apply, but for example, in our utility side, there's not a fee structure set up in the past for somebody who has to go and get their meter replaced every couple of months, because it's all construction sites and they're running them over and stuff, so. If we don't build something in, we have nothing to turn around and to base it off of, so just remember that as some of the justification for some things.
And perfectly reasonable, you know. And that's not one of those cases where hopefully you're going to use it too often, but you need to have it in place just in case. No, that makes sense.
And this may be a little bit early to raise this issue, but I think according to the budget calendar, this committee is to submit a formal report to the board in mid-October.
Yes.
Okay. However, the board is going to see the budget at the working session in the first week of October. So the only question is, does the board expect any feedback from this committee at that meeting? Or do we wish to give them some feedback at that meeting? So there was a little bit of, shall we say, commentary last year when the board was initially presented the budget, that there seemed to be some expectation that we were supposed to provide them with a formal report at that time. I think we were caught by surprise. They were caught by surprise. So it's just an issue of, I understand the formal report in October, mid-October. The kind of the swing point is the early October. You know, what are our expectations at that point?
Well, I think it's for them to have the opportunity to review everything, we'll kind of let that sink in, and then you guys are also given the opportunity to present your recommendations, and then after that point, in October is when they actually would vote on it.
All right.
Now, if you guys feel like that needs
That's,
modified,
well, I think that doesn't seem an unreasonable path to me. I mean, Gary, from your standpoint as our board rep, do you see that timeline as problematic for the board, or is that something you think folks can handle?
I confess, I did not bring my calendar with me.
well, it states board review of recommended budget on September 15th, or around then. Then F&P committee report to the board October 6th, which is the working session. And then the October 20th is when the board would actually vote on the budget.
Just to me, it does seem out of order. I'm just be real honest with you. It doesn't make sense to me that the board receives a brief on the budget, a recommendation from the staff, and then after that, we come with, hey, here's the Finance and Planning Committee's thoughts, because it
Well-
just seems out of order. That's just my take.
It could give off the wrong perception too, depending, if we came in with some suggestions, good or ill, might put us a little out of alignment.
We can put them on the same day, or, to be honest, we kind of copied what we had before and just from the prior year and tried to kind of clean it up, and maybe this is one that
Yeah.
we should
I mean,
flip.
we will have had a fair look at the budget prior to October 2nd, or whatever that date is. It would seem that it is possible for us to have preliminary, not final commentary that tells the board generally what we think. I'm still
What if-
comfortable with the mid-October final report, that seems reasonable, but something from us to the board when they see the budget for the first time. I mean, that seems appropriate, especially if we formed some reasonable preliminary opinions at that time. I mean, I think that's possible.
So
But we've never
maybe,
done it before.
so maybe everything on October 6th, you guys present to the board along with us presenting the budget, or are you thinking you guys give a recommendation before we even present it? I mean, I think we would need to be presenting it so that they
Mhm.
know what they're looking at.
But I think somewhere within a week at most of the time, rather than September 15th, 3 weeks later, we give a review. I think somewhere around the 13th through the 22nd, something like that, of September.
Well, and this was just,
Yeah,
the F&P committee to the board, that was set because that was the regular board meeting.
Yeah.
The September 15th is not a regular scheduled first and third Wednesday.
Why isn't it the third with the board?
That's what I'm saying, we can make it that way. That's what I'm,
So just, I mean, looking at your timeline, we're here, the middle of August. We're basically 30 days away from a recommendation by the staff to the board on the budget.
you're talking about for,
That's what I'm reading on
The
here.
September
Board
15th
review
one?
of recommended budget on September 15th. That's basically 30 days from now. Okay? That shapes everything. Once you tell the board this is where we're going, you're gonna give some feedback, but at that point, there isn't, you've kind of narrowed the window of budget discussions and all that kind of
so
stuff.
then let's just consolidate all that for October 6th, and I don't think that would be an issue.
I'm just throwing it out, it just, for sure you would want to have,
That gives you guys more time, which is what's needed, and it sounds like maybe it's kind of being condensed down to,
I'm not as much,
having gone through this before, that timing does seem
tight.
really tight, really, really tight.
because basically they're giving us from September 1st to September 14th to review the budget.
Right.
We don't meet that frequently, so that means either one meeting or we're gonna have to add several meetings in there to really truly understand the budget. And it would seem that whether it's simultaneous or something, where when the board gets the recommended budget, there's some initial comments from F&P or whatever, that seems more reasonable, but anyway, just looking
No,
at it.
I'm following
Yeah.
you. And like I said, maybe if we worked it to the same day, because I do know last year, we did have several meetings with F&P. It was not on a, some of it wasn't even just weekly. It was a couple of times a week in a few situations.
I can believe that.
So,
I can believe that. Well, so it sounds kind of working right to left. I mean, where is the board, where's the timeline for the board's actual finalization of the budget or approval of the budget?
they need to approve October 20th.
Okay, so they're going to need a couple of weeks, just like everybody else, they're gonna need a couple of weeks of time to absorb the budget. Thinking about it a little bit, yeah, it does make sense that we should have a recommendation in there somewhere between the middle of September and the first time the budget gets briefed to the board, you know, and I don't exactly know how much time's required there, but I would think that whatever feedback we give to the staff, they need the opportunity to absorb and accommodate before before they actually do that presentation to the board. So we're probably looking at the board getting briefed in early October. We would have to have feedback ready to the staff, I would think no later than about the third week in September, to give the staff time to be able to incorporate it. And then when we come up for the meeting in October, when we brief the board, maybe the budget briefing is, I want to use the phrase tag teamed, I'm not exactly sure that's the right phrasing, but the concept being, then we can stand up kind of side by side and say, yes, we reviewed the budget, we provided a little bit of feedback about the budget, that feedback's been accommodated, we're comfortable with the budget as it is, and give that assurance to the board as they process the budget.
Well, and that's what I'm saying, if we do them on the same day, I think that executes that. And the way that this worked last year was we worked through it in-house. We came to F&P, presented things. We worked through all of that. So by the time we were ready to present to the board, you guys had already pretty much given your recommendation without it having to be in writing.
Yep.
So all of that needs to be in play before we present it to the board. So whether you want to do it a little bit, or on the same time, or what, that's fine. But I don't think I think the board should get the budget at least at the same time, if not before your recommendation though, because if your recommendation is coming and there's nothing for them to be viewing to put it against, it
I agree.
doesn't help.
Yeah, because I think there's, to your point, I think there's two different bits of timing on the recommendation. There's the recommendations that would go back to the staff, that has to go back a few days in advance of the board brief, and then our feedback to the board probably can go in parallel with the briefing of the budget. And the hope would be those two, you know, whatever his recommendations are have been adjudicated, and we're in a position to stand there and say, yeah, we're good.
Yeah, I guess what I hear, just looking at the dates that you have on there, if you were to take the board review of recommended budget, which is currently on September 15th, and push that to the 6th of October, still gives them 2 weeks before the 20th when they have to make a decision on approving the board. Then we still do the review with the staff, but it gives us more time to review with the staff and get everything cleaned up before we get to the 6th. That's just my,
Yeah.
and it uncompresses the schedule of days available to work with the staff and adjust them.
I'm fine with that, I understand that.
Yeah, that makes sense to me.
So they're both on the 6th, that's what I will communicate this back.
So committee comments and presentation would be October 6th? Is that what you're
Yes.
saying?
I think the briefing of the budget to the board and the whatever commentary FNP would provide against that budget would both happen on the 6th of October.
Yes.
And then to Jeff's point, that potentially gives us a little bit more time.
So,
Probably not a lot more time, might give us another week or something to be able
Gives
to.
you about 2 more weeks of time to work the budget with the staff. If there's truly, to do the give and take, okay, we review it, they have to go back and chew on it, they have to, and then come back, and
Yep.
so it gives us about 2 more weeks, 2.5 weeks of a little bit more back and forth with the staff before we have to finalize our input and they finalize their input to the board on the 6th.
Yep, I agree.
so, that being said, if we back it up, the review proposed budget with F&P committees, consolidated department review, which is pretty much our final wrap-up after we've gone through stuff, which is kind of the public side of it as well, is what we did last year, we asked the board members to come. On here, we've got the 1st through the 14th. So if we were to do the 1st through the 27th, and then that still gives us a week for any final stuff that should all be laid to bed before the presentation.
That sounds about right to me.
And I'm thinking in terms of this committee, if we stick with our Mondays, then we're talking the 6th, the 13th, the 20th, and the 27th, and hopefully not the 4th. But last year, that is what we did. We met the Monday prior to the board being, having presentation. And I don't know if, it's okay, yeah, 6th, 13th, 20th, 27th. I don't know if there's any.
So the only question I have is, this is just a practicality question, do the POA staff work on Labor Day? Normally not, right? That would be an off day
Correct.
for you guys. So the 4th is not really available to us. I think you gotta pick
Right.
sometime during that week, okay, copy them, we'll go on Wednesday or whatever,
Yeah.
give them a day to breathe on Tuesday when their inbox is completely shot, or something like that would be my sense. Just because I've lived that world. We all
Like
have.
the 8th, 13th, and 20th?
8th, 13th, 20th, 27th. That gives basically the staff, after they meet with us, time to rework things, and then we can come back to each week. You know,
Yeah.
kind of continue to tweak it as we did like with the 7-year O&M.
Yeah. Well, and that's kind of like I was saying with how we had to do it last year. There was probably a couple of weeks where we had several meetings just in order to get everything covered. So, however we need to.
Well, we
And
can
then-
certainly schedule those dates, and then if we have to, once we start to actually get eyes on the budget,
Which
if we gotta put extra meetings in there, we can.
Yeah. And hopefully it'll go much smoother since we're following the same process as it was last year. You guys are familiar with things at a higher level, or I should say, more detailed level. And it's gonna be mimicking the 7-year O&M for what is obtainable.
Yeah, exactly.
So you guys should be fairly familiar.
Yeah. So we talked on and off about the high probability that there'd actually be 2 budgets.
There will.
There'll be the baseline budget, which is CPI-based plus historical data. And then there would be a second budget that would be based on the projected revenue available, assuming that we had a successful assessment of whatever path the board chooses for an for that. Are we still on that path?
Yes, I'll be preparing 2 budgets. They will be identical other than, capital additions on the version 2 and some payroll adjustments, for the added staff and stuff, if we were able to execute that
Got it.
for the road crews and stuff.
Yeah.
Other than that, everything else should be identical.
Yeah, so I'd just kind of skipping ahead, I'd think there'd be a line item for some particular task, and there'd be in the baseline budget, there'd be some dollar amount associated with that, some capital acquisition associated with that task. if the assessment increase was approved, then there'd be a different number there, probably a larger number to some degree.
Yeah.
Okay. Sounds good.
One more question on this, just from a process standpoint. You talked about fees and all that kind of stuff. So is the intent on the 23rd of August, which is our next scheduled FMP, that's when there will be the fee review and discussion?
Yes.
Or do we need to add one on the 30th?
No, that's where I was saying, we're meeting this week, so then our next meeting, we should be able to cover it all.
Okay.
Okay.
Then if, at that point you guys feel there needs to be another discussion, we could, but I'm hoping that we'd be able to knock it all out.
Well, it sounds like if you're gonna finalize your reviews this week, we'll probably get some read-ahead material about
Yeah.
that before the 23rd.
I'll pass it all out so you guys can come up
Hopefully
with
we
your
get to the
thoughts.
23rd and we can get that item taken care of. Okay,
I'm checking. Okay.
cool. Well, it might have been a little more than 10 minutes, but it was a useful conversation. Any other thoughts before we tie that topic up? Okay. Thank you. Good conversation then. So there were a couple of actions to do some policy red lines. I've seen a couple, I saw Tom's red line on reserve funds, and I saw Carl's notes this morning. I'm not sure if they were on the same document or they were different documents.
It was the same document.
Same document, okay.
Yes.
And I apologize, I haven't had a chance to absorb them and really
I
understand.
apologize for the late distribution of that. I was trying to get my hands wrapped around some of those policies.
Did you?
No.
That's not a fair
Welcome to my
question.
world.
That's not a fair question. Start up, I'm just scanning through. Got some good thoughts there, Carl, for some of the things we probably ought to think about putting in here.
It's a lot to absorb in the half day you've had this. Reading through the original policy, it's a great baseline. I think there were definitely some missing parts to it. I think this just, whether it's useful or not, or whether it's all acceptable, it's just maybe adding more clarification to the policy itself, and as well as who's responsible for what, directions on how to get the funds approved, the logistics for that. So take it for whatever it's worth. It's not original. This is just from my research.
I think it's good stuff. I know one of the challenges in trying to craft these things is trying to figure out where the policy stops and where the process starts. You know, the policy being, you know, the sort of high-level view that you want to establish, and then the process being the mechanics by which the material runs. I think a lot of your suggestions are absolutely things that need to be included in that process for how some of these things are manipulated, you know, either established or the funding levels changed or the funding accessed and repaid and all of that kind of thing. I don't know, just me talking out loud here, I don't know whether we embed those in the policy document in the appropriate place, or whether we identify that there's policy and then there's the process by which the policy is adjusted.
You guys have more experience on this. I've thrown out the suggestions, you know. Doesn't hurt my feelings if none of it is accepted or not. It's just I want to do what's right.
Well, I just don't know mechanically what's the POA history or what's the right path, because you could intertwine the two.
Sure.
Or you could kind of keep one here and one there, and I don't know what the right model is for being able to follow that.
Board sets policy, and processes are set by, in order to ensure those policies are met, is set by staff
Okay,
and the GM.
okay.
That doesn't mean that
Are they built in the policy or no? What the staff does. for
processes are
process?
not, no.
So-
Usually your policies are left a little bit more at the general basis so that it can cover more of a broad spectrum.
Sure.
So question for you on that then. What is written as our process for preserving house?
That's the question.
That's, so,
I mean,
so-
this
Which is
clearly
why I-
lays that out, or some
Yeah.
of it does.
Which is why it's being presented here in the beginning. This is something that I believe it's more than just my insight or just the GM's insight, and it's everybody, and y'all's buy-in. And so working together, even if some of your recommendations may not make it into policy, it doesn't mean it doesn't need to be adapted into procedures.
Right.
So,
yeah,
I think in important situations like a reserve fund, I think you probably need to, in my opinion, over-document it, because the changes in board members, changes in staff, you just want to be very clear of who's doing what, when, and where kind of thing. So whether it's in the policy or written procedure.
Yeah, so,
and it is a very short policy that is out
Yeah.
there on reserve funds. I
Yeah.
mean, they did not have them in the past. They were set up. Obviously, they've still been in the build-up stages, so now is a time that we're kind of reaching what that set amount was. We need to reevaluate it all.
and I think, you know, what we could do is, as we look at what we think the policy entails, to your point, Larry, yeah, some of us have thoughts on also process and procedure, but versus just tossing them aside, I think we say, and staff, here are some key things that you either need to adopt and/or
Agreed.
incorporate into what you write down as the process and procedure for executing this policy.
agreed, agreed.
And then I think that makes the tie and connection between the two. We could debate whether or not we want to then follow on and see what eventually gets updated or drafted at the process and procedure level, but I don't know if we need to dig into that part of the business.
Yeah, I do think we need to probably need to take the commentary here and then whatever other commentary that generates and kind of drop it into one of those two buckets. Because I'm inclined to agree with you, Jeff. I think there's, historically, when I've had to handle stuff like this, I kind of like the policies to be high-level and generic and relatively unchanging, you know, and then the process underneath it can adjust as the organization changes or as needs change or things along that line. And we just need to make sure when we're going through this that we understand, is this particular observation a policy observation that should be in the policy document, or is it one of those process things that ought to get accommodated as part of the documentation for how it's executed?
Yeah. I think the only thing to consider on that, don't disagree with what you said exactly, I'm fully on board, but the only thing I would say that we have to at least consider on this, because there's a lot of money in there, and property owners probably care about that, we might put some hooks in there that maybe in the purest sense would be process, but maybe just to instill confidence in the community of property owners, maybe you put at least some mention or something of those things just to show that they are covered either in the policy or will be covered in the process and procedures.
No.
Can you give an example of that?
I like that thought process.
Okay. Can you give an example of what you're talking about?
And Carl actually wrote it in his, because that was the one I was thinking about. Okay, so something happens where you might want to draw upon your reserves. Okay, and we can all imagine something that happens. There's a whole process that you would, and procedure that you would think the staff would be going through to bring forward some kind of recommendation to the board to say, please let us spend some of this money, we need to do it for this reason. I don't think all of that needs to be in the policy, but you might want to say something in the policy to the effect that the expectation from the board is that the staff will do due diligence, blah, 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 or something. I'm not telling them how to do the process or the process and the procedure, but I'm putting the expectation out that that will be done. And it gives confidence that we don't just use the money
I agree
without clarity, you know what I'm saying? So that's kind of what I'm saying, and I think if we read through each little part, you can kind of go, we probably don't need this in here, but we can't leave the void, so we need to put
Right.
some tie
Yeah.
to the expectation from the staff.
Okay, great.
I think the expectation side of it would flow very well between the two.
Very well put, thank you.
I think we're all violently agreeing with you, Jeff.
I am.
Okay.
So I guess a question for the group is, how do you want to approach the next part of this? Because I think we probably do need to go through that exercise and say, is this part of the policy statement? Is this a process item? Is this an item where the details are gonna be in the process, but we need to put a reminder in there? Do we wanna go through that as a group? Do we wanna go through that individually? I don't know what we wanna do.
I'm willing to take the original Tom's edits, Jeff's edits, this stuff, put it all into one, then can really redline it at that point. Because I think we've got too many different versions, and we need it in one document to start really at the red line. And I don't mind doing that. I've got time this week, so it's perfect timing.
Deal.
It also, yeah, thank you. It also, it segues into the other policy, the working capital funds. Because I think a lot of this would also be the same.
I would think
Some,
I think there would be an
I
eerie
also-
similarity between the
there's
policies and
similarities.
probably
There are
between the
similarities,
processes
yeah.
too.
Yeah,
We hope never to use this.
yeah, exactly. do, though, the reason I didn't have a draft is I still need to get my hands around what we talked about last time, the numbers, and there were a lot of numbers going through my head. If you have, Karina, 30 or 45 minutes this week just for a call, so I can get educated on that, some of the nitty-gritty.
Well, I tried to watch the video, so I don't know what numbers you're referring to.
Yeah, I'm not either, so.
But, yes.
I think I heard, and I might be wrong, there were two funds that we wanted to set up.
Two new funds.
Working capital.
Working capital,
Yes.
yes.
And I don't recall the numbers for either of those. I think one was like $1.5 million. I don't recall. And I'm not sure where that came from.
Non-utility one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Mhm.
Okay. And then there was something related, was it the 3 million or whatever for the PPP money funds?
That's separate.
That's separate.
That's totally separate.
Yeah. Well, the PPP money was 3.089 million, if I remember correctly, and that had been held in abeyance until the loan was forgiven, which happened 60, 75 days ago, something like that. So most of that money, Karina could do this far more eloquently than I can, but most of that money was then allocated to top off, if you will, the legacy reserve funds that were called out. There was a little bit of money left over from that. There was a little bit of money left over from rollover from the previous year. And then there was some additional funds available and then after that, after the reserve funds were funded, then there was another look that said we've got a little under $2 million left, if I remember the numbers correctly. Some of those funds were allocated, some of those funds were not. So and Karina, I think that's where Carl needs a little bit of help going through the math of all of that.
Thank you, because there was the mention of the board allocator to designated funds, and I think I asked where that might have come from or where I could see it. I don't know if I ever got a copy of that. So that's probably part of my confusion.
Okay.
Can I make a counteroffer?
Sure.
I view my time as cheap, and I'm pretty comfortable with the numbers. I view Karina's time as way valuable.
Okay.
Do you mind if you and I work on what you need, and if there's, dead ends that Karina
That's
has to?
fine. That's fine.
Yeah, I
Thank
would,
you.
Yep.
I really value your time.
Yeah.
Way more than I value my time.
I
More
was
than
actually
she does.
embarrassed to ask because I know you're
Yeah,
in
don't-
the middle of the budgeting process.
Don't be embarrassed to ask me.
I'm not.
Okay, good.
I wanted it from the horse's mouth.
I don't mind helping either, though,
Okay.
so.
I appreciate it. I'll get with you later.
Well, that way hopefully we
Yeah,
can keep your calendar a
I'll-
little clearer and your email a little
Okay, I
lighter.
gotta get financials done this week.
Yeah, gotcha. So thank you for the offer to take the various comments here and consolidate them. I think that would go a long way to making it easier for us to do that allocation.
Okay.
So, but I do think both you and Tom had some really good thoughts and really good observations in here to work our way toward better documents. And to your other point, when we get into the documentation of the new funds, there's probably going to be a stunning similarity between a lot of that language
Yes.
and these documents. So,
Yes.
cool.
So,
Okay.
are you guys, I don't mean to interrupt, I apologize. As far as our current reserve accounts, they were set up as asset replacement accounts, reserve accounts. And what we're trying to do, or what I'm presenting, and I hope you guys are all on board, and I think from all y'all's modifications you are, but I just want to verbalize it and make sure. Turning those two into more of the true emergency, back burner, don't touch, it's not your asset replacement accounts. Okay. Because that's what those new accounts are set up
That's what I
for.
vote for.
Sir?
That's what I vote for.
Yeah, again, I think you're right, you're absolutely
So-
right. I think that's where we'd all like to see this go.
I just want to make sure we're on the same page.
Just because
So
now
for
that you have,
clarification, the old asset replacement is replaced with emergency, whereas these new funds are more for, or are they
Asset.
both emergencies?
The new funds are for your asset replacement.
Okay.
The
Yeah,
so
whole
that's-
thing is have your money before you spend it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think the big fundamental difference between them is the legacy reserve funds, let me use that phrase. The idea there is they're well and truly your emergency funds. The new funds that were the working capital funds that were established are really intended to be used. You know, they're intended to be built up for targeted purposes and then consumed against those targeted purposes and then rebuilt as the demand and our ability to replenish that money is available.
Correct. And that's where I want help as far as establishing guidelines, which would be procedure, but I want buy-in from everybody. Of this is what we need to do to keep contributing, these are the criteria to take out, and so forth.
Yeah, yeah.
Because if you look at that, you know, that 7-year O&M thing is a lot to digest. But if you look at that, there are large expenditures throughout all that.
Right.
Okay? In her cash flow business, okay, you don't have that large cash just sitting there to go, oh yeah, we can do that now. Okay, she's got to save for it. But these give us a way to save
Sure.
ahead of time, knowing that that's coming down the road. But then to her point, once we spend it for that, we're gonna need to have a plan to build that back up again for the next big expenditure coming down the road. Which allows her then to work with the staff to create, don't let me speak out of turn, but this is the way I understand it, to be able to then, okay, let's plan for this. We can actually build a contract, we can actually go out on contract versus let's wait until we get all the cash and then we'll go and do the contract and all that kind of stuff. Otherwise, we're taking a lot of risk if we're asking to do all that ahead of time without the cash in hand, right? So because we're a cash flow organization, this gives us a way to plan ahead, budget for it, get it in place, execute on timelines that are more realistic to availability of resources, et cetera. We just need to have a good strategy going forward on how those get used, how those get replaced, how they get refunded again, replaced, et cetera, back and forth.
Just for a little bit of history, in the past, all of your capital was built into the budget, which is all based upon your assumption for your revenues going forward, obviously. Well, if you start purchasing all of your capital items and having your operating expenses and everything else at the beginning of the year, because you're assuming you're gonna bring in all this revenue that was built in to cover it, and that doesn't happen, that's when we have run into issues. Capital spending comes to a halt and so forth. And so I'm trying to actually build up those funds, like, and then replenish, like he says, yes. Which gives better planning
Schedule and
all
what I'm trying to
around.
look at, what you're looking for.
Good conversation. That's a good point, Karina. I think we're all sharing the same thought that you have. We'd really like to take these reserve funds and truly make them funds that would only be touched in the event of an emergency or statement of compelling need or whatever, fill in your favorite phrase there. You know, and let the capital funds be the way that we save for the future as we go forward.
Thank you, I just wanted to make sure there was no misunderstanding and we get down the road and you're like, wait a minute.
Oh, no. That's fair point, you know, just because nobody said it, or just because nobody disagreed with it when you said it, does not necessarily mean everybody agreed with it.
I'm sitting here thinking a little bit of how much from a time, because I've been on this committee long enough to know that the staff wastes a lot of time preparing a bid for something, and then we find out there isn't money. And so they go back for a bid, and then there's controversy as to, what do you mean it's 20% more? 6 months ago it was this. Well, that's what that delay, and that's what these operating reserves or capital fund, the working capital will do.
Yeah.
That's from a layperson's standpoint.
Well, and it makes for bad business. We used to have that problem in my legacy company. And the problem would be after you go back and ask somebody, because they have to spend resources to go prepare that bid, If you ask them for a bid and then don't execute the contract, and you do that for 2 or 3 years in a row, they start no bidding the job.
And we've definitely encountered that.
Mhm.
So we want to build better relationships with our vendors, and,
Yep.
and part of that is they're streamlining our process.
Yep,
Being able to
absolutely.
execute.
Absolutely. Okay. So I think Carl has the action to compile our various feedback items on the policy document. Hopefully we'll have a chance to look at that at the next meeting. Anything else in that area, or are we ready to break to the next topic? So the next item I had was, maybe this won't take as long, was the discussion. We did get some feedback back from the village banker regarding, excuse me, find the right place. It looked like it was a little bit of a combination of a draft policy statement combined with some of the investment approach, I guess is the best way I can describe that. I don't think there's anything wrong with the information they gave us for the policy document, though I think I would say we'll let that piece of information become raw input for Carl's compilation more so than talking about it again here. But I think the real part that we probably would want to talk about would be, depending on what the fund is, what would we want to see, or what would be a good idea from an asset allocation standpoint against that fund? And I didn't say that very well, so let me pull it back and try to say it again. If I have a fund that's well and truly an emergency fund, that I am not planning on touching, it's the last fund I'm going to touch, before I have to go do something really desperate. I probably have a different mix of investments in that fund than I have in a fund which is going to be the next fund up the line, so to speak, in that line of defense. The first 1 or 2 funds in that defensive line are probably going to have to be a good bit more liquid than perhaps some of the other funds that are the second and third layer in that defense. So I don't know if anybody has any. It looks like on page, looks like 4. Well, it says 4. Oh, okay. 2, 3, 4, 5. That's interesting. Oh, 4, 4, 4, 5. It looks like on 4-6 is the one I was really. It's the section titled Asset Allocation. And that sounds like that sounded like the banker's recommendation for potential distribution for a reserve fund. But I don't know much more about it other than what's written in here. Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. That, to me, looks like the general account of a life insurance company.
Yes.
I mean,
It's
it has
to me, it's
real
an
estate
overplayed
and
thing.
equities in it, which is about 1 billion miles away from what we're thinking. So it's a very generalized asset allocation model for a huge pile of investments that you really aren't looking to tap as a source of liquidity. The problem with 100% of our cash reserves are, whether it be short-term or intermediate term, it's all liquidity. It's if, you hope that you don't have to spend your emergency reserves ever, but if it comes a time that you do have to, you don't want it in equities, you don't want it in real estate, you don't want it in venture capital. You want it in highly liquid, marketable securities that don't, dip 23% because interest rates go up 2%. So that particular model, I just took one look at it and said, that doesn't apply to us. before I go too far, probably have already gone too far. Right now, the 1.54 million of operating reserves, which is clearly for emergencies, as far as I can figure out, is invested in something that kind of looks like a 5-year ladder of CDs.
There are some CDs, there's an intertwining, and I've asked Karen for some clarification on it all. But it's like, our total assets are backing the,
Line of credit.
the line of credit, then there's also a letter of credit. But then there's the Cetera investment, which is backed by the CDs. So there are some connecting pieces, but I need to get that picture right now as clear as mud for me.
Oh,
So,
because I would really like to know, and for what you're saying is the answer may not be nearly as simple as I think. How is that 1.54 million invested? I mean, because I would think that that is a segregated, quote, fund, and you should just have a report on one piece of paper that says,
well,
blah, 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 here's 1.54
well, it
million.
is, and those are into our Cetera fund, our
Right.
investment. But then our line of credit is backed by the Cetera investment.
And that's okay.
So that's what I'm
Yeah,
saying, they overlap.
I'm okay with that. It's just a little bit to answer, or give me a point of view on Larry's question, which is, in principle, I don't see why the capital reserve funds for utilities and non-utilities can't kind of sort of look like the 1.54 million. Right now, they're just sitting in a money management account of some sort, and we're leaving money on the table. If somebody were told me that your ladder of CDs are earning 20 basis points or something like that, I would go, that's kind of market rates. I mean, it's not a lot of money on the table, but it's kind of the principle of it, and interest rates aren't going to stay this low forever. Or they might, who knows? But in principle, I don't see why the reserve funds can't kind of sort of look like the 1.54 million.
And that may be something we need to explore.
Well,
I think that's where we're at, is what
Yeah,
do we
that is
do?
where we're at right now. But it starts with, where's the 1.54 now, and what does it look like?
It's in CDs.
Yeah, so.
Yeah, and I think there's another factor to that you touched on, Tom, and I don't know what the right answer is. But you certainly want, if it's a fund that you're going to potentially have to tap into, you certainly want it to be liquid. The thing that I don't have a good feel for is just how liquid does it have to be? I mean, for example, you take an example of some significant event happens, some act of God, you have a tornado or something like that, you smash up a bunch of equipment in the village. Well, you're gonna have to have some cash available immediately to do whatever stabilization you have to do, then you're gonna have to put suppliers under contract to go fix whatever was badly broken. There's gonna be some time associated with that repair, and so you're gonna need a certain amount of money up front. You're gonna need some cash up front to basically get it started. You're gonna have to be able to tap those assets as the supplier invoices you to be able to pay those bills. But I don't know exactly what that timeline, looks like. I think the thing we have to be a little bit careful with is the idea that we're gonna need to cash out an entire fund next week. Well, that puts us in a very limited opportunity from an investment standpoint, where, yeah, maybe I need seed money next week, but, my invoices are not gonna come in for 60 to 90 to 120 days, so I've got a different timeline that I'm gonna require some percentage of that cash. And that's where, and I don't know that there is an absolute right answer. I think a lot of this is gonna be the comfort level of Karina and the comfort level of those of us on the committee about how much of that money needs to be reachable at any given point in time.
Would it not also be, we have three funds, right? We have
public utility, non-utility, and operating. I think it's different for each one of them.
I think you're right.
Operating, probably need that one fairly quickly, because that could be paying people. You know, that could be paying salaries, et cetera, which is within a 30-day window or whatever. Agree with you that if something bad happens, you don't have to pay day one. There's insurance claims, there's all kinds of stuff that's gotta go on, there's just getting people on contract or whatever, if you're contracting to help. So, to some degree, you can stagger that. Now, what's the right stagger? That's the question I think you're really asking. What's the
Exactly.
right, how much stagger can we take of the, 1.9 million in public utilities and the 2.3 in non-utility assets? How much stagger can we take in them? And, I think we were hoping that, the bankers would give us, some examples. I don't think the example they gave us is helpful for what we're thinking, but, okay, maybe we're just gonna have to figure it out ourselves. But I think that there is, to some degree, a stagger there, which then allows you to invest. Because if you don't assume a stagger, there is no investing. You're just putting it in, the lowest percent checking or savings account you can get and just accept your nothing. That's probably not realistic in execution.
Yeah, I think you're right, Jeff, and that kind of takes me to the next thing that was in my head, which was when we go to do this, we're not the domain experts in this space. Let's be real about this. I think what we need to do is we need to articulate, we got a few steps before we can go engage some of the experts, but we need to articulate a little bit more clearly the kind of funds that we have and what can be done with those funds. We need to identify the dollar figures associated with it. We need to have some general understanding or general thought about how much of that money needs to be accessible. It's probably fund by fund, to your point. How much of that money needs to be accessible, immediately versus 90 days versus 180, I don't know whatever the time windows are. I think if we can do that, then we can go back to some of the professionals and say, look, this is where the village is right now. This is what we think these funds are, this is the order that we would engage these funds if we had to draw money. Here's the degree of expected expenditures that we'd have. And based on that information, they can either come back to us and say, well, that might be what you think, but that's not what our experience shows. It's more like this. Okay, great. That's good information. And then the other part of that is based on what that distribution looks like, what would be their recommendations for some kind of an investment model, to get us that, to try to find that spot where we get a little better rate of return on the money without putting the community in a risky situation, either from a asset fluctuation standpoint or from a standpoint of not being able to have the cash available when we needed it. But I think we've got a few steps to get to before we can actually go bring a banker in here and say, be it our current banker or be it other bankers, and say, hey, here's what we think.
What is our interest rate on the line of credit?
We have never drawn on it, so
But,
I'd have to
yeah.
go and look.
Don't know.
Okay.
Depending on that, and I don't know if this is allowed yet or not, but, to prevent some of guessing on staggering, borrow against the line, and then shuffle the money back around to the
Yeah.
right accounts.
Sure.
So you prevent some of that staggering. But again, if you're paying 4%, that may not be enough. That may be too much. But if it's lower than that, it might be an option.
Yeah, well, if it costs you 10% to liquidate an asset and you can go in and you can liquidate it for free in 60 days, maybe you're better off to go use money out of the credit line and pay 4% for 60 days until you can liquidate it and pay it off. I kind of understand your model.
On my perspective, what we're looking at is our operational funds, we're not gonna be able to really do anything with.
Yeah.
We typically do not run at a high balance as what it has been. So, in my opinion, those really are not touchable. We need those on a daily basis. The reserve accounts that are about to be fully funded, I don't see why we should not be able to go out long-term. I would say at least 18 months, 18 to 24 months in some kind of a venture. Now, whether that means combining it with what we already have in CDs and having to restructure all of that, or doing it separate, I don't know. It sounds, kind of what I got was, without combining it all, we may not have enough to do a lot
For them.
for them.
I think it's.
That doesn't mean, anywhere else. But I don't know how easy it would be for us to move that stuff around either. So we may only be looking at just our reserve accounts. And then with the new ones that we're doing, it would be probably something more like an interest-bearing account, because we are going to have to take so many draws out, on a consistent basis.
Yeah.
So really, our long-term, it is the reserve accounts, and like I said, maybe 18, 24 months, depending. But I know that they're saying the 12 months isn't doing much at all. Where you're starting to kind of see a difference is at the 18 months. And with it being our last step, and if we were to utilize our line of credit and so forth, if we came into a situation where we absolutely had to, I think we would be safe going that manner. Because all else fails, before you go and pull on that reserve line, go and take it out of the capital account, and then account for the fact that you gotta build it up more. I think some of those are options as well if we work into them correctly. But that's just my point of view.
Yeah, we're in a very interesting place compared to where we were 5 or 6 years ago. We actually have options to consider on how do we draw assets if we need them. Where not that long ago, we basically went through the couch and looked for loose change. So, okay. Well, like I said, I don't know that that conversation can go an awful lot further right now, but I wanted to kind of tee it up and get people's thoughts on it. It feels to me like we've got a couple of predecessor steps that we have to execute to be able to get to the point where we can go out and talk to a banker. We understand, to your point, Karina, there's a certain amount of dollars that are going to have to be kept, pretty much fully liquid to be able to run the day-to-day operation. Got that, no problem. Some of the different reserve fund accounts that we have, depending on what we think the threat is to draw on that money, maybe they invest differently. Something like the Cetera account that we currently have, that may be something that we adjust over time. The advantage of having this laddered CD approach is you probably got a certain amount of assets that are maturing pretty much monthly, I would guess. So.
I think it's actually 2 big CDs, and they matured last year while Wayne was trying.
Okay, so if you as those things mature again, you have the ability to reallocate those to a different investment approach if we think that's the right thing to do.
Well, I guess in summary, what I'm trying to say is, I don't think you have a whole lot of play with your operating. You're not gonna have a whole lot of play with our capital ones where I think interest-bearing, and your play is gonna be with our reserves.
That's probably true. But still, with those 3 funds, that's $4.5 or $5 million. It's not a small amount of money to leverage.
4.2.
Or 2.
If you just do public utility and non-utility,
Okay.
still, it's not a significant amount of money.
Yeah, that's a pretty nice chunk of change.
It's gotta get us better than just being in a money market.
Yeah. Yeah, every little bit helps. Okay. Anything else there? I appreciate you indulging the somewhat open-ended
Yeah.
conversation.
I do have a question.
It's needed.
With this, with regard to this, what are specific next steps you have in mind, or you have to think about it?
I don't have a specific mix in mind. You know, I really don't.
Mhm.
I don't have, you know, in my legacy firm, there were people that got hired and got
Yeah.
paid a lot of money to do stuff like this, and I didn't have to worry about it too much.
Okay.
So I didn't have to sweat it that much. I haven't really thought it through.
It seemed like one of the big issues, if not the big issue, is what Jeff said, is how big is your stagger? And that would seem to me, if we're talking about getting a little bit more juice out of our reserve funds, that is the big key question. But without being able to talk to experts, it's kind of hard to say. Now, back in my old job, and since I'm a numbers cruncher, the way you evaluate that is you take a five-year portfolio and a 3-year portfolio, and hopefully real-life portfolios. And you can do that with, say, Vanguard funds. Then you look at the monthly returns, and you see how often they go negative, because that's the only thing you care about. Now, Vanguard has a fund called the Ultra Short-Term Bond Fund, which is like a 1.1-year average life, which kind of fits into your scenario. The problem with that fund is it's not only short, but it's got a boatload of corporate credit. So it's sensitive to both changes in spread, credit spread, and interest rate fluctuations. I don't know what the statistical history of it is, other than it doesn't go negative very often, and if it does, it pops right back up again. So I'm not saying we want to take our money and plop it in there, because we can't. It violates so many of our things. But in terms of interest rate behavior, it kind of says that if you had a 2-year average life of, say, treasuries, it's not going to go negative very often, and God willing, if it does go negative, it just pops right back up again. And if you have a 2-year average life and it always pops back up within 3 or 4 months, it probably tells you you have the adequate liquidity to protect you against, well, the stagger risk, essentially. But that's a geeky, you know, actuary kind of approach to things. But that's what I would ask an expert, is that a legitimate way of looking at it, and what kind of statistical data do they have with a 2-year portfolio versus the 3-year portfolio versus the 4-year portfolio? My guess is, and I'm making this up totally, Cetera has that. They should, and if they don't, then they don't have nice things to say about them. But, I mean, that's what a professional investment advisor should have access to, that kind of statistical performance data, historically.
I'm going to inject, kind of in response to that, a layperson, villager, extreme conservative to that. In our existing investment policy, it says the investment objectives, number 1, ensure the safety of funds. And while that is an indicator, I keep thinking of these things that come along with the radio ads. Historical past performance is no indicator of what may happen in the future.
Right.
And I'm sure some of those, any funds, to me, interfere a bit with the safety of funds. Now, that may be an over-conservative approach, but just as a thought.
What you say is absolutely true. Number 2, if we have, let's say, a 3-year portfolio, there's no amount of statistical data in the universe that says you're 100% bulletproof from
Right.
rates just going up forever. But you do know one thing. If you have a short portfolio, the stuff that's maturing in 1 year, you're going to reinvest it at a continually higher rate. So, but yeah, you could have a long-term bear run
Yeah.
in the market, but that's going to happen. Well, I mean, your alternative is just stick your money in a money market fund, and then don't worry about it.
Yeah.
And if that's our conclusion, that's our conclusion.
Well, and that's where it is now.
That's where it is now, right.
It's the least common denominator solution, I guess is probably the way I'd put it. You know, I know I've had some stuff over the years in something, my guy put me in some stuff called a unit trust. And the idea was it could go negative, but it typically didn't. It usually was a 24 or so month security that was pooled dollars that was invested in typically S&P 500 kind of issues that paid good dividends, and basically they paid you a guaranteed return over that period of time. So it was by no stretch of the imagination was it a CD or anything like that, because there were no guarantees associated with it. But from the standpoint of the user, it looked an awful lot like a CD that paid anywhere between about 3.5% and 5%, depending on where you were with interest rates. And I know in the last few years, when the market had some significant run-ups, some of the firms started putting in participation clauses in those, where if they hit a certain hurdle rate on their return, then you would get an extra quarter point or something like that with your return, so you were invested with them. And, you know, there may be similar kinds of vehicles available to the POA to be able to participate that are, you know, to your point, there's no such thing as absolute guarantee that you're not going to lose money, but there's, you know, when you spread that around across a market basket, it takes a huge downturn in the market to cause a negative effect, you know, in something like that. So there's a lot of, I'm sure there's a lot of vehicles out there that the professionals who do this every day are way more familiar with than we are.
Well, we have our 401k company coming here within the next couple of weeks to go over stuff with the audit committee and everything. And I'm gonna take the opportunity to talk to them, because while they do our 401k, they probably have some other options as far as the investing side, because they're the ones that do the investment side of it for us. And I know that they're very accredited and very, for lack of a better word, picky. They have a very tight criteria of who they decide to even use and stuff, and so maybe there has an opportunity for them to come and share some information with us.
Sure. I think that's a great.
And maybe
idea.
an option to work with them as well.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea.
Who is the company?
I'm having a brain fart. Securian?
Okay.
Probably one last word. What got us in here to me is the original observation that something like $11 million of funds at the beginning of the year was, quote, unprotected. Right now, we're sitting in, I guess, a Regions Bank account, and that is probably, quote, unprotected. If that money happened to be moved into a Treasury mutual fund, short-term Treasury mutual fund, earning, you know, or money market fund earning, you know, 1 basis point at most, that would probably, I think, effectively move it from unprotected to protected, but then that requires more work on staff in terms of moving money around and stuff like that. But one of the criteria is safety, and we do not have yet a point of view on $11 million at Regions Bank versus money sitting here and there at this, you know, a Treasury money market fund versus a Treasury, you know,
Well, and I
three
think,
different ones. And it's something that we have to think about down the road.
well, like you said, that is what brought us in here to begin with. But I don't know if you guys recall, but even if we were to split it all up into a bunch of different accounts and money market accounts, even if they're all still with Regions, we still have that same problem.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you're really looking into diversifying a lot of things.
If we own directly, ourselves, in our name, a Treasury money market fund, that's pretty bulletproof.
Well, I'm talking about, you're still gonna have the issue with your regular operating account
Well, yeah,
and everything else.
But I'm trying to get the $11 million down to $6 million or something. It's just a smaller number. But we don't have to commit to that or anything like that. It just seems to be an issue that will eventually be put on the table for us. And I'm just saying, you know, that's more of a longer term point of view of the complexity of the problem we have to deal with.
The name of this thing escapes me right now, but I've heard of, for lack of a better way of saying it, an association of banks, or let's call it a bank, that will take your money and pass it around to all these other banks. It's a little bit of a headache probably on the accounting side, but you're much more protected.
It's effectively reinsurance in a banking industry
Yeah,
or
it's-
something
it's
like
not technically that, but yeah,
Yeah.
that, but then there's also that option too.
I think the real, you know, and I know there's always a concern. I mean, nobody wants to lose money. But there's always a concern, but I mean, anytime you invest something, there's a chance, be it a low chance, something might happen. I guess the rhetorical question I would have, I get the concern that you've got more money than an FDIC limit, you know, in your bank account. But I guess my question would be, when was the last time anybody heard of a bank in the United States folding and the shareholders of the bank getting stiffed? You know, and I don't believe that's happened since the 30s. I might be wrong.
That's
Maybe-
because they arrange sales when they get to the point
That's,
that
you
they.
go through a merger and
Yeah.
your funds are still just
There've
like they
been
were
a-
the day before.
Yeah, there've been a ton of shotgun marriages, you know,
Yes,
between banks and
precisely.
financial institutions. 2008, 2009 was a great example of that. But my point being, nobody ever lost a nickel.
Exactly.
Well, and if they do, it would be backed pretty much by the government up to the 250,000. But
Yeah.
I think what you're talking about, this is out of the blue again, but Ameritrade Institutional has an account where what I get is simply a statement of you have this much in this account. But it is invested, and they shop it pretty much every month, depending on maturities. I have a share up to 250,000 in any individual bank.
Right.
And they manage it. All I do is say, I want that,
Yeah.
and you get it.
There's also,
It's nice.
Another maybe little unknown fact. You know, after this whole several years ago, when there were a lot of bank failures, I think the government says, we're gonna insure you for this amount. But there's a group of banks that the US government supposedly will protect. And if Regions is on that list, you may have not much to worry about.
Yeah.
That they're gonna protect them somehow. And I'll, between now and next time we meet, I'll get the name of that thing. There's a specific term for that.
Yeah.
Is this a too big to fail type
Yeah,
situation?
Most
Well, and I
times.
think they're one of the top 3, top 5
Yeah.
in the US. That's what they had said.
Regions? 13.
13.
If you're in
In
the
the
top,
US?
if you're in the top
13
15 or
in the US?
20, you're probably gonna get
13th largest.
preferred treatment. Of course, you might also, that doesn't necessarily mean you won't be part of one of those shotgun weddings if something goes
Right.
awry.
Yeah.
You might be the one with a gun pointed at you instead of the other way around, but, you know, it is what it is.
Through a merger, though, all of our assets are fine, like you're stating. And if we're able to come up with a way to invest a chunk of what we've got, I think that helps clear up the issue, at least the part of the issue of why we brought it up in the first place, back to Tom's point.
Anything else? So I just had one last item on the agenda. Let's take a few minutes. And I'll classify this as potential preview of coming attractions. Few things going on. Clearly, we're working on the reserve policy documents. As part of the FRAD-F outbrief last week, we very much recommended that the board consider putting in a policy for what I'll call funding earmarks, for lack of a better definition. Basically, establishing a policy that says a certain minimum amount of funding is going to be allocated to a critical infrastructure item on an ongoing basis, and then demonstrating via the budgeting process and the accounting process that at least that much money is actually being expended against that particular need. That's probably going to turn into a policy statement with an underlying process. I think right now that's probably going to be in the FRAD-F job jar. But we may get a cycle of it from a review cycle just for safety's sake as that policy gets formed. There's a couple of other policies that are being looked at out there. One of them related to lot take-back. There are mechanisms in place that the folks at the POA use if somebody calls and says, you know, I inherited my lot from my Uncle Joe. I have no idea where it is. I don't even know where Arkansas is. I don't want the lot. How do I get rid of this thing? You know, so there's some processes that they use and some approaches they use right now. They really need to be codified for the protection of the staff. They really need to be codified because there's just not a lot of documentation out there about how that's working. Similarly, either suspension of development in a neighborhood or a targeted development in a neighborhood. So it's kind of the plus and minus case of that. You know, there are sections of the community that are underserved from a standpoint of roads and utilities. It requires a declaration change in order for the POA to declare that property unserved. But there are execution approaches that the POA can use to try to justify no longer providing support into an area, you know, because of the ownership of the property. On the flip side of that, there are other parts of the community that are potential targets for development, very much like the Ciega neighborhood was a couple of years ago, where that was a experiment that turned out to be very successful, where a builder was given the ability to develop a dedicated piece of the community, and there was some investments made there in order to make that happen and allow that to occur faster. So both of those things again are not really codified right now. You know, so there are things that might potentially end up in our job jar, either to participate in the creation of or to review the results of, you know, as it gets put together. There's also, I think, a better than average chance that we'll be asked to participate in the development of and probably the evaluation of some proposals for potential multi-year procurements. Golf carts. The golf cart fleet needs to start being recapitalized in 2023. So the idea of putting together a solicitation to go out to 3 or 4 golf cart manufacturers that says we have this number of golf carts spread across this number of years. Here's our, here's our replenishment schedule. We want you to tell us what they cost to buy, what's trade-in value, what do they cost to lease, you know, what's your warranty coverage, you know, basically I'd put together a statement of work that would be broadcast out to 2 or 3 vendors and let the vendors respond with their offers and evaluate those offers and see if there's somebody that you know, generally take 3 or 4 in a situation like that, narrow it down to a couple, you know, talk to them a little bit and try to get a best and final offer and get best available price for them. You know, I think there's an opportunity for golf carts. There's an opportunity for a lot of the golf maintenance equipment, similar kind of a model. There are companies we traditionally buy from, but it doesn't necessarily mean they're the only player in the game. So that's also a possibility. And last but not least, the ambulance contract is a similar kind of a situation where there's a lot of interest on the part of the more than one ambulance provider to be able to become the exclusive provider for the village. So any one or all of those might come our way in the next few months. You know, the golf cart contract would have to be something that would be evaluated by the end of 22 because we'd have to put it into place as part of calendar year 23. I believe the ambulance contract has the same timeline. I think
What's that last name?
The ambulance contract.
Oh, ambulance, I'm sorry.
Yeah, the
I
ambulance
thought the
contract.
ambulance contract is by the end of this year, right?
Originally, they said it was the end of 21,
think
but it's
it's
actually the end of
next.
22, I thought.
Yeah, it's next.
So,
And what
so
was the middle one?
it doesn't reset until, I don't know, I'm going to assume January 23 until somebody gives me a better date. That's just my guess.
And so Tom doesn't have to correct me, it was golf carts, ambulance provider, and there was one in the middle.
And
Golf
golf
cart
cart maintenance equipment.
Equipment,
Maintenance
okay,
equipment.
thank you.
Now, just for clarification, are you talking about reviewing the RFPs that are going to come back in from this, or are you talking about a different type of involvement?
I think it depends on how the staff wants us to engage. I'll put it that way. I think we could help draft it. We could help evaluate it. We could review the results and recommendations. I think it's really a question of how the staff wants to pursue those options.
Thank you.
And I really don't have a preconceived notion one way or the other. To my mind, it's however we can best help the organization get best value.
Because, I mean, I know specifically with the golf carts, there will be an RFP that's sent out, and then my assumption would be that we would then bring all of that back to get your guys' input as well. So
Yeah.
that's why I was asking how involved, if you meant prior, like you mentioned.
Sure, like I said, I think we could engage as part of reviewing the RFP before it goes out. We could engage in reviewing the results coming in. We could engage, so kind of how does the staff and how does the board want us to engage?
Gotcha.
And as a suggestion, it seems like I've seen what some people on this committee can do. It might be a good, if the staff is willing to engage them as much as they possibly can. They don't like their lives anyway, so,
They don't like what?
their lives.
One of the other recommendations that came out of FRADF was that the board consider bringing on staff a professional contracting officer, for lack of a better title. And honestly, if you had that contracting officer on the team, then they've probably got the majority of this in their skill set, and our engagement would be minimal. If in the interim, until whether or not that decision gets made and whether or not that individual gets brought on board, if there's a way we can help the staff work through some of these opportunities, then we certainly want to do that.
At least for the big ticket items.
And that was really all I had on the topic, was I just wanted to kind of give everybody sort of an overview of some things that might potentially come our way. I didn't have anything else. Did anybody else have any other topics? Hearing none. Motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
Second.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. We are adjourned. Thank you, Dakota.